Hey guys, tonight we begin with mud. Not metaphorical mud, not the kind that writers use to describe hardship or messy lives. No, real mud. The kind that squelches beneath hooves and sticks to the underbelly of everything. We begin in a pen, on straw soaked with urine and steam. We begin with something that doesn't ask to be born, doesn't know it has a name, and never will. You won't find your way into a castle tonight. No banquet halls, no stained glass redemption. This time, you're lying low, low to the ground, belly to dung, snout to silence. You are a pig. Just a pig. And in this medieval village, that's not a joke. It's a sentence, a position, a role in a world that knows exactly how little your breath matters. But don't worry, you're not alone. I'll be here, step by muddy step, as we move through a life both brutal and bewildering. We'll see what it means to be judged before you can speak, punished before you understand, and remembered not for what you did, but for what they needed you to represent. So settle in. Let the straw scratch your skin. Let the cold find your spine. Let your ears twitch, your tail flick, your heart slow. Because tonight, history doesn't walk on two legs. It grunts, born in the mud, when your first breath smelled like dung. There is no moment of silence, no gentle swaddling, no whispered welcome into the world. You're pushed out into straw, soaked in urine, blood, and last week's rain. The piglet beside you squeals without knowing why. You, too, begin with breath, but not the kind poets write about. Yours is sharp, foul, thick with the stench of animal waste and old hay. You breathe because your body demands it, not because there's comfort here. Your eyes are sealed shut for the first moments, not by nature, but by grime. You don't see your mother's face, only the shivering mound of her side, trembling from effort. She does not look at you. Pigs do not look at their young unless hunger or danger is involved. You root blindly, nudging the others, your snout colliding with damp fur, clots of afterbirth, and a teat slick with milk. Warmth arrives not from care, but from crowding. You survive because you're fast enough, desperate enough, not special, just present. The humans don't notice you yet. They might later, when you've grown enough to be weighed, not for joy, for trade, for food. But today, you're just another number in a litter that no one counted aloud. One of many small blind mouths scrambling in filth. A future sausage with a beating heart. Above you, the barn roof leaks. The drop hits a board, then splashes nearby. The rhythm is constant. Tap, tap, tap. Like a drum counting time in a world that doesn't change. This is your first music. This is your first shelter. And this is your first lesson. Life begins low. Not metaphorically. Physically. You are beneath everything, the straw, the sow, the hierarchy of the pen. Later, they will call you many things. Meat, nuisance, curse, but never child, never creature of wonder, and you won't know to care. Because here, under the weight of warm bodies and colder straw, you're not expected to dream, only to feed, to fatten, to grunt, and root, and die. And yet there's something in that breath, that first awful inhale, something that lingers longer than the stink, something like memory, something like a beginning, even if no one else noticed it. So, you wiggle, you grunt, you press deeper into the muck, because survival isn't noble. It's instinct. It's mud in your mouth, and milk on your tongue, and a world that begins not with light but with dung. And with that scent still clinging to your skin, we move to the next chapter. Because being born in filth is only the beginning. The real question is what happens when they teach you that filth is your identity. Eating trash, living royal. You eat everything. Not because you're foolish, but because you're free. Your teeth don't ask permission, and your belly doesn't wait for approval. Onion skins, cabbage leaves with black veins curling along the edges, bones picked clean or not picked at all. They land in your pen like blessings from the gods of waste. Sometimes it's rags soaked in broth. Sometimes it's a fish head with one eye staring back. Once, it was a boot heel, softened by rain and made tender by time. You chewed it for hours, not for taste, but for the joy of chewing. They laugh. Of course they do. Cleaner than the priest's broom, they say, watching as you nose through the day's discard like it's treasure. A woman drops the end of her bread and doesn't even flinch. It hits the mud, crusts down, and becomes yours. A child tosses the tail of a rat, half curious, half cruel, and when you take it without pause, he claps like you've performed a miracle. But to you it is a miracle, because while they pick through barley and count crumbs, you feast. While they wait for permission to take more than their share, you take what no one wanted and turn it into strength. There is a kind of royalty in that. Not the kind that wears silk, but the kind that survives every famine with a full gut and no apologies. In the slop, in the sludge, in the warm rot of yesterday's sins, there is satisfaction. You chew, and for one long fat moment you are full. Truly full, not just of food, but of purpose. You were made for this, not to taste, not to savor, but to transform what others abandon. Your stomach doesn't discriminate. It doesn't turn its nose up at mold or meat or marrow. It understands something deeper than rules, that hunger doesn't care about pride. Hunger eats, and so do you. But even as you revel in your grotesque feast, you see them, the villagers, their wrinkled noses, their turned backs, their whispered insults. They mock you not for what you eat, but for how you don't hide it, how you've become what they're afraid of being, shameless in your survival. And that thought clings. It gnaws at you harder than any gristle, because if you discuss the starving, if those with hollow bellies and dry tongues can still manage to look down at you, then what does that make you? A joke? A curse? A mirror? The slop bubbles. The rag slips deeper into the mud. You lick your snout and don't answer. Because royalty never explains itself. But royalty can still remember. So let's carry that memory now, the taste of rot, the weight of judgment, the echo of laughter too sharp to be kind, as we move toward the next lesson, where what's outside your skin starts to matter even less than what seeps into it. When children laughed, but mothers watched. It begins with laughter high, sharp, and bright like wind chimes made of cracked bones. The children arrive in a cluster, boots squelching, sleeves too long, cheeks red from cold and mischief. You hear them before you see them. The creak of the gate, the slap of a turnip on wet wood, the whispers rising into shrieks as one dares the other to touch your snout. You grunt not in fear, not in anger, but in acknowledgement. You've learned this routine, the poke of a stick, the squeal of delight, the little foot that hovers just close enough to make a show of bravery. One girl, bolder than the rest, tosses a beet at your side. It lands with a soft, meaty thud, and rolls into the straw. You don't flinch. You've been hit harder by rain. Their joy is simple, unfiltered, and completely innocent, which makes it dangerous, because behind them stand the mothers. They do not speak. Their arms are folded across their chests, fingers tight on elbows, faces carved from stone in winter. They do not smile. They do not scold. They just watch, eyes narrowed, lips pressed together like they're holding back something heavier than words. The children don't notice, but you do. You always do. They don't trust you. And it's not because you're a pig. It's because you're that pig. The one from the story no one tells during daylight. The one that moves in whispers and unfinished sentences. Something about last winter. Something about blood. Something about the cold and a scream and a door that opened too late. You don't know the story, but you know the silence that follows when your pen is mentioned. The shift in conversation. The way the baker's wife once spit at the ground near your gate. Not directly, but close enough. You know how some mothers cross themselves when they pass, and how others pull their little ones tighter by the wrist when you grunt too loud. If you had a name, maybe it would be Curse, or Lesson, or That Thing We Should Have Never Kept Alive. But pigs don't get names. Not really. Not unless they're pets. And you're not that. You're something between livestock and legend. Flesh that breathes too long after it should have been forgotten. So you roll in the mud. Not because you enjoy it, but because it hides the sound of the children's laughter. And more importantly, it dulls the gaze of the mothers. If you look stupid enough, slow enough, harmless enough, maybe they won't look at you like a threat. Maybe they'll forget. Maybe you will forget. But you don't. Because even in straw and filth and shadows, you can feel the weight of a stare that doesn't see you, only the ghost it wants you to be. Still, you grunt. You blink. You turn your side to the next beat and let it land. Because pretending not to hear is easier than pretending you weren't already listening. And as that false silence settles again, let's follow it. Let's move to where the body starts betraying its own shape, not through fear, but through function. Because in a world that watches you too closely, sometimes the only defense left is to grow too large to carry. 4. The day you bit the wrong hand. She smelled like milk and fear. A girl barely taller than the slats of your pen, her hands trembling, her breath quick and uneven. She wasn't like the others, not loud, not laughing. She came alone, without the cushion of a crowd or the cruel safety of children's cruelty. Maybe she was trying to be kind. Maybe she was told to feed you. Maybe she dropped something and just reached a little too fast, too close, too unthinking. And then it happened. A flash. A squeal. Not yours, hers. Your jaw closed before your mind understood. It wasn't anger. It wasn't revenge. It was hunger, that twitchy, automatic kind of need that doesn't come with thought. A hand near your mouth is a thing to test. A thing to take. You didn't know her fingers from a carrot. You didn't know. You just reacted. The scream ripped through the barn like a crow splitting the sky. She ran. Blood on straw. Blood on your teeth. And for the first time in your short, stinking life silence came not from sleep, but from shock. By nightfall, the priest arrived. His boots made no sound on the dirt floor. His cloak smelled of incense and mold and something heavier judgment. He didn't look at you at first. He looked at the straw, at the smear of blood, at the way the villagers stood just far enough to seem brave without risking anything. Then he looked at you. Not like the children, not like the mothers, not even like the farmer who feeds you. He looked like someone peering through bars at a sentence already written. He said your eyes were wrong. Too dark. Too knowing. He said Milicia, that thick word full of spit and Latin, and everyone nodded like they understood. He said the devil hides in bristles. You didn't understand the words, but you felt the shift. That night, they tied a red cloth to your pen. Not tight, but visible. A sign. A warning. Not for you, for them. You'd become the thing that must be remembered in silence. Children were told to keep away. The girl's bandaged hand was shown in whispers. The laughter stopped. And you, the one who had only dreamed of turnip peels and moldy crusts and the warmth of dung on a cold morning, now you dream of rope. Not the kind that ties hay, the kind that pulls, tightens, ends. You don't know when it will come, but it hangs over your thoughts like steam on a winter breath. Every creak of the gate, every footstep near the barn, every rustle of cloth makes your skin twitch. Your hooves sink deeper into the mud. You didn't mean to bite, but meaning doesn't matter when fear needs a face, and now you are that face. So you lie down. You grunt softly. You let the red cloth flutter like a flame you're not allowed to flee from. And you dream, not of food, but of forgiveness, a thing no one gives to pigs. And as the red cloth fades into the night, so too do your chances of returning to innocence. But innocence, it turns out, was never yours to begin with. Not in a world where even silence is a weapon. And the next lesson? It's not about what you've done. It's about how they decide what you're for. A trial you didn't understand. The rope itches. It's tight, not choking, but close enough to remind you with every breath that your body is no longer your own. You stumble as you're tugged from your pen, your world of mud and scraps and swatted flies into a space that smells like fear dressed up in formality. The village square is fuller than usual. Not market day. Not a festival. Something else. Something colder. The people gather in clusters. Men with folded arms, women with pursed lips, children standing on tiptoes behind barrels and crates. Their faces are strange, not like when they used to feed you scraps or giggle at your snorts. Now their eyes are tight, their mouths twisted. Some sneer, some smirk. Others look away, as if even watching you might dirty them. You're placed at the center, tethered to a post. You try to sit, but the rope pulls you upright again. You grunt softly, not in protest, but confusion. Your ears twitch at the words. You don't understand them, not completely, but you feel their shape, their rhythm. You hear accused, you hear child, you hear murder, you hear sentence. You know some of those sounds. You know that none of them mean meal. A man in robes steps forward. His shoes are cleaner than anyone else's. His voice carries in a way that's been practiced. He gestures toward you like you're a lesson. He speaks for you, about you, not to you. He says you are a pig, that what you did was instinct, that you didn't mean harm, that you don't understand malice, only appetite. And it's true. You remember the girl's hand, the warm rush of blood, the scream, the way everyone pulled back like you'd become something contagious. You remember being afraid after, but not during. During, it was just movement, hunger, reflex, no intent, just the old rhythm of snout and mouth and the scent of food. But here, today, none of that matters. The villagers don't speak, they only listen. And when the man finishes, the silence is not relief, it's verdict. No one meets your eyes. They look at the ground, at the sky, at their shoes, but not at you. As if looking would make it harder, or easier, or real. And then the rope gets shorter, just slightly, enough to shift your balance, to make you lean forward without meaning to. You grunt again, confused. The crowd murmurs. The man in robes steps back. The wind picks up, and for the first time in your short, dull life, you feel something new, judged, not fed, not avoided, not ignored, judged. You didn't know you were capable of crime. You've never known anything but instinct, grunting at noise, turning towards scent, following heat, avoiding pain, wanting food, sleeping in straw. But now, they've given your hunger a name. They've dressed it in guilt, and they've wrapped it around your throat like a rope made of words. You don't understand the trial, but you understand the rope. And as the sky grows quieter, not darker, just quieter, you feel the world shift around you. You, the pig, have crossed a line you didn't know existed. A line drawn not in straw or mud or blood, but in the minds of those who need something to punish. So let's walk across that line together. Because next comes the part where punishment stops being about justice and becomes theater. The prison before the sentence. They don't kill you right away. That would be too simple, too silent, too quick for a story that needs to be remembered. Instead, they create a pause, a space between judgment and action. A space that smells of mildew and dust, and the kind of waiting that makes your muscles ache in stillness. They move you to a pen behind the church. Not the usual one, where the sows sleep and the piglets root and the straw is warm with life. No. This one is smaller, narrower. The boards don't fit together quite right. There's a draft even when the sun is out, and the floor is always damp, as if the ground beneath you has learned how to weep in secret. No other pigs nearby. No grunts. No bodies pressing in for heat. Just you and the rot-soft straw, curling at the corners like paper forgotten in rain. The bucket of water is cloudy. You sip from it anyway, not from thirst, but out of habit. Hunger doesn't visit much now. Even your belly seems unsure what to ask for. People walk by. Not in crowds, not like the square, just one or two at a time. Slow steps. Hesitant glances. Sometimes they pause, speak low to one another, point without pointing. You can't hear the words, but you know the tone. It's the sound of people who want to look merciful while watching something suffer. A boy, maybe 12, maybe less, tosses you a piece of crust. He doesn't laugh, doesn't call out, just stands there, watching it land in the straw. You eat it. Not because it tastes like anything, but because chewing fills the space between questions. And then there's the priest. He comes when it's quietest. Not during Mass, not during meals. He stands just beyond the gate, robes heavy with the smell of oil and thyme. His hands stay folded. His mouth doesn't move. But his eyes, they burn. As if waiting for you to blink wrong. As if there's a truth hiding in your pupils that might absolve or condemn the village depending on how you grunt. You don't grunt. You lower your eyes. Not out of guilt, but because you don't know what he wants. He stares anyway. And sometimes, When the wind changes, when it shifts just right and carries the scent of straw and manure and hay, you smell them. Your brothers. Still alive. Still fattening. Still wallowing in a world that doesn't expect anything dangerous from a pig. Their snorts reach you faintly, curled and muffled by distance and wall. You breathe them in like a memory, like a language you forgot how to speak. They weren't smart enough to bite. They weren't stupid enough to bite. And so, they remain innocent by default. But you, in your quiet pen of mildew and fog, you have become something else. Not animal, not human, just a symbol of mistake, of malice, of myth. And as you wait, not knowing what for, only that it's coming, the world forgets to feed you regularly, to clean the straw, to say your name if you ever had one. Because even punishment needs to ripen. And you, pig that you are aging into your sentence. So you lie down, and you dream, not of freedom, but of forgetting. Because when the pen becomes familiar, the rope feels further away, but not forever. Only just enough to pretend it's not already tightening. The cloak of blame. You become a story. Not a pig, not a beast, not a body with breath and bone and hunger. Just a story, passed from mouth to mouth like bread at a table no one invites you to anymore. They say your name, if you ever had one, with a curl of disgust, or worse, with pity. And each time they speak it, you become less flesh and more fable. They say you killed a child, bit his face, took his breath, not out of fear, not out of hunger, but because you're cursed. Because something dark settled in your gut the day you were born and has been waiting coiled ever since. They say it behind hands at the well. They say it louder after wine, when sorrow softens into storytelling. They add things. You leapt, you roared. You dragged him through the straw like a wolf disguised in mud. But you remember. You remember the child. Not a ghost, not a victim, just a boy. Small hands, laughter like water spilled across stones. He climbed into the pen when no one was watching, his cheeks stained with berry juice. He touched your snout and you didn't move. He smelled like sweet roots and sunshine. Then he slipped, fell, that's all. You remember his eyes wide, not with fear, but surprise. And then the scream that wasn't his, the scream that started it all. Now, the village breathes around you like you're made of smoke. Everyone pretends not to see you, but you see the change. The pigs walk differently now. They grunt more carefully, as if noise might be misread. They nudge the trough slower. They don't crowd the fence anymore when footsteps pass. Even they, your brothers, your equals in stink and straw, have started to flinch when the children get too close. Because your blame doesn't end with you. It drapes across all of them like fog over a field. Thick, heavy, unasked for, and impossible to shake. That's the thing about blame. It's a cloak. It doesn't ask your permission. It just slips over your shoulders rough, damp, too tight at the throat, and suddenly you're not a pig anymore. You're a warning, a cautionary tale. And once it's on you, no one remembers what your back looked like before. No one remembers the sound you made when you were happy. No one remembers how you once danced in a puddle after rain, or the way you squealed when the slop had extra apples. They only remember the story. You wear it now. You sleep beneath it. You breathe through it. You grunt into its folds and hope it doesn't smother you in your sleep. And yet, despite the weight, despite the silence, despite the eyes that won't meet yours, you live day after day, covered in a thing you didn't make and can't take off. Because that's the final cruelty of blame. It makes survival feel like defiance. So, survive you do. And in the shadow of your own story, you wait not for forgiveness, but for the next chapter. Because stories don't end just because no one wants to tell them anymore. Excommunication for swine. It begins with footsteps, measured, slow, like a ceremony pretending not to be a sentence. You hear the bell before you see it, a faint metallic chime that doesn't belong in the dirt. Then voices. Not the usual village murmurs or curious child whispers, but something older, thicker, woven in syllables you've never heard but somehow understand. They bring holy water, a silver bowl that catches the light like a threat, a brass crucifix. The priest walks in front, robes dragging a clean path through the filth. Behind him, 2 altar boys, one solemn, one trying not to laugh. The villagers form a semicircle, careful not to come too close, as if your very breath might curse them now. You grunt, not loud, not angry, just a sound, a question maybe. But no one answers. The priest begins. Latin wraps around your pen like smoke, curling into the corners of the sky. Words sharpened by centuries, by books, by hands that have never touched anything as real or as warm as mud. He raises his hand, sprinkles the water. It falls in cold spots across your back. You flinch. They call it excommunication, banishment from God's grace. And for the first time, you are told, not asked, not taught, but told that you had a soul, that you had something worth saving. And now, it's gone, declared lost, condemned. You don't know what God is, only that it smells like smoke and distance, that it wears robes, that it looks away from you while condemning you, that it never once came to your pen before today, and now it arrives only to leave. The priest doesn't meet your eyes. His hand trembles slightly on the cross. Maybe it's fear. Maybe it's doubt. Maybe it's nothing at all. The altar boy drops the bell once. It hits the ground with a sound too loud for a creature too low to matter. And then, just as quickly, they leave. The words fade. The crowd disperses. The silence returns louder now, thicker, as if it's pressing against the walls of your pen, folding in around your breath. You don't feel different. Not at first. Your hooves still ache. Your ribs still show. The straw still stinks of mildew and piss. But when night falls, the rain comes. Only on your pen. Not heavy. Not a storm. Just a curtain of cold, tapping the boards, soaking the straw, darkening your skin like ink across parchment. You curl in the corner, trying to find warmth in a space that feels smaller than before. And that's when you notice it. Something missing. Not outside. Inside. That faint pulse of something soft between your ribs. The hum that used to be there, even when the world forgot you. It wasn't hunger, it wasn't hope, just warmth. A quiet flicker that made life something more than waiting for the bucket. Now, it's gone. Not taken. Just banished. And, in its place, cold. A cold that doesn't touch the skin but burrows beneath it, that whispers in the straw, that makes you close your eyes and wonder not about death, but about absence. You never knew what grace was, but now, in its vacancy, you begin to understand. It wasn't something they gave you. It was something you carried, until they took it. And the worst part? You let them. The rope is measured like a sermon. They tie the rope with a care that almost offends you. Not in haste, not in rage, but with ritual, like braiding hair before a wedding or threading a needle before a baptism. Their hands are steady, their voices low, one knot, then another. Fingers practiced, gentle even, as if kindness could camouflage the purpose. The rope itself is thick, rough. It smells like old hands and fear not yours, but someone else's. The kind of fear passed from father to son with every retelling of what happens when order must be restored. You feel the weight of it before it lifts. It sits across your shoulders like blame woven into fibers. Dawn is gray and long. No sun yet, only suggestion. The earth is damp beneath your hooves, as if it too has wept in anticipation. They walk you from the pen, slow and deliberate, as if walking quickly might dishonor the scene. You try not to stumble, but you do once your foot catches on a root or memory. You fall sideways into the mud. No one moves. No one helps. They wait, silent, watching, as if gravity itself is another step in the punishment. You rise on your own. Of course you do. You always have. The villagers trail behind, not like a parade, more like a shadow. Some murmur, others avert their eyes. A child coughs. A dog barks once, then goes quiet. A man near the front carries a bucket of stones, not for you, but for ceremony. Another holds a cross, too large for one man. He struggles to keep it upright, and for a moment, you wonder if it will tip, if it might fall and break the silence into something honest. But it doesn't. The gallows are modest, built for men, but they've been adjusted for you, boards added. A platform strengthened, a crowd gathered under the pretense of tradition, and somewhere near the back, someone whispers a prayer. Not for you, for themselves, for protection, for distance. The rope is adjusted again, measured. Not too long, not too short, just enough for justice. They say it matters the length, that it determines the dignity of the end, that if it's too short, it's suffering, too long, it's scandal. But the right length, the just length, that, they say, is mercy wrapped in precision. You've never understood that. Never understood why cruelty must be dressed in arithmetic. Why violence needs to be symmetrical. Why suffering, to be accepted, must be measured to the inch. You watch them work, heads bowed, fingers checking knots, one last glance to ensure everything is in place. And you realize, this isn't about you. It never was. You're just the punctuation, the full stop at the end of a story they've already decided how to tell. A tale not of pigs or instincts or accidents, but of order, of power, of the illusion that precision makes pain more palatable. The wind shifts, the noose hangs still, and you, pig, sinner, symbol you breathe in deeply, not because you want to, but because someone, somewhere, decided that the sermon must end exactly here. The executioner who apologized. He doesn't speak to you, not in words, not in comfort. But his silence is thicker than the rope, and it clings to the morning like mist. His eyes don't meet yours. His hands, though practiced, aren't steady, and that tells you more than any confession. He pats your back once, not tenderly, not cruelly, just automatically, as if you were a cart horse, or a stool, or a nail that needs straightening. A motion built from habit, stripped of meaning. And yet, in the way his fingers rest a beat too long before lifting, you feel something. Not pity, not absolution, but recognition. He's done this before, too many times, and yet this one feels different. You don't move. You let the pat settle into your spine. Let it soak into your hide. Let it become part of the morning. The man is large, not like a giant, like a wall square, tired, carrying more weight than his own. His boots are worn but clean, his apron stained but folded right. He smells of iron and ash, and the sourness of sleep cut short. Beneath that, mud, fat, bread gone stale, and something else. Something quiet and bitter, and clinging the scent of someone who's forgotten what it's like to be touched without purpose. He mutters something under his breath. Not loudly, not for the crowd, just for the air, just for the rope, just for you. You don't know the words. They're not Latin, not scripture, not law. They're soft, broken, not made of hate. They sound like regret, like a prayer no one ever taught him. He steps behind you, adjusting the knot. You feel it tighten, not sharply, just enough to say, "It's time." You turn your head slightly, enough to see him, not clearly, but clearly enough. His jaw clenched, his eyes red. His hands, moving not like instruments of justice, but like limbs that wish they belonged to someone else. And for a moment, you remember his face. Not because it's important, but because it's familiar. The same lines of hunger, the same shadow of sleep, the same quiet ache beneath the skin. You don't know who he is. You never will, but you know what he is. Another animal dressed as a man, doing what he's told. You breathe in through your snout. The rope creaks. The platform shifts. And all around you the world watches as if this is normal. But it isn't. Because in this instant, in this hush, between judgment and justice, you feel it. The man about to end your life doesn't hate you. He knows you. And in his hesitation, in his stuttered breath and muttered apology, in the tremor that runs from his wrist to your spine, he admits something neither of you can say aloud. You are not so different. You both were born hungry. You both live dirty. And now, you will both carry this moment, one of you into silence, the other into shame. The rope tightens. The wind pauses. And in that final second, the last thing you understand isn't the weight of the noose or the gravity of the law, but the echo of his scent in your own. Mud, fat, old bread, fear. That is your communion, and no sermon is needed after that. The pig who escaped his sentence. They say it happened years ago, before the last harvest, before the bishop's visit, before the gallows were painted fresh for appearances. Just after a frost, when the morning still smelled of burnt hay and brittle silence, a pig like you walked free, not ran, not fled, walked. Through the open gate of his trial pen, past a distracted scribe, beneath the half-raised eyes of men who thought they had more time. He wasn't fast. Pigs rarely are. But he moved with purpose, step by step, through the muddy square, past the bakery, past the church, past the place where they kept the stones. He didn't squeal, didn't look back. The villagers stared, unsure whether to laugh, shout, or kneel. Someone dropped a ladle. Someone else muttered a psalm. No one chased him. Not really. A boy gave a half-hearted jog. A clerk raised a finger, then lowered it. The priest, white-faced and suddenly less certain of God's fondness for process, declared it a sign that the animal was chosen, that the judgment was reversed by a higher court, one with no books, no robes, and no gallows. But the others whispered different things, that it was cowardice, that the pig had tricked them, that it was unnatural, that it remembered something it shouldn't have. One woman crossed herself. Another tightened the scarf around her daughter's face. A man spat and said, "Even pigs want justice now." But secretly, they admired him. Not out loud. Never out loud. But in the quiet corners of kitchens and fields and barns, they replayed the moment the way the pig's feet moved with deliberation. The way his tail flicked once, like a goodbye. The way he crossed the threshold of the known and entered the forest, not as meat or monster, but as something else. Because even if he died out there cold, alone, hunted, he died not theirs. He died without a rope, without a bell, without Latin spit across his brow. He died on his own terms, unwashed, untried, unnamed. And in doing so, he did what no villager ever truly. He left, not the pen, not the village, but the role. He stopped playing the part they'd written for him, brute, sinner, lesson, and rewrote the ending with muddy hooves and a quiet stare. They say he was never found. Some say wolves got him. Others say he joined a herd of wild boars and grew tusks and thunder. A child once claimed he saw him by the river, snout to the wind, smelling the rain like it was scripture. You don't know what to believe. But sometimes, at night, when the straw shifts just right and the air smells like pine and maybe possibility, you dream of him. The pig who refused the rope, who vanished not as property or punishment, but as mystery. And maybe that's the greatest rebellion of all, to disappear before they finish writing your name, when pigs stood trial beside men. It sounds absurd now, doesn't it? Like a folk tale twisted too far, like something whispered to frighten children into obedience. But it happened, more than once. A man, pale and shaking, and a pig, mud-streaked and wide-eyed, dragged before a tribunal in the same breath, one wearing a tunic, the other a collar. One accused of theft, or heresy, or blood, the other of being an accomplice, of being present, of acting as if it knew better. They stood side by side in the cold morning light. No cage for the pig, no shackles for the man, just ropes. Loops resting gently on shoulders. A reminder that justice, here, was more spectacle than salvation. The courtroom was small, damp. The floor packed with earth that had known more footsteps than prayers. Candles sputtered in their holders. A crucifix watched silently from the wall, its carved eyes chipped, its painted lips too tight to speak. The man talked. Oh, how he talked. He denied. Then he begged. Then, in a moment of collapse, he wept not for innocence, but for recognition. For someone, anyone, to see that he was still something more than meat waiting for judgment. The pig said nothing. Of course it didn't. But that silence, it said everything. It stood there, its body still, tail unmoving, breath low and slow, as if aware, deeply aware, that any sound would be interpreted as guilt, that any shift of weight would be read as arrogance, or defiance, or sin. And somewhere in the crowd, someone whispered, "The pig looks nobler." It spread like infection. A joke at first, then an observation, then a belief. Because what is dignity, really? In that room, it wasn't language or pleading. It wasn't theology or law. It was presence. And the pig, blank, mute, immovable, owned that space like a statue, like an accusation carved from flesh. In the end, both were sentenced. The man, with final rites and murmured regrets, was led to a priest. The pig, without prayer or pause, to the gallows behind the granary. No candles. No absolution. The man was buried in consecrated ground. The pig was not. But that week, when the villagers spoke of what they had seen when they relived the trial in whispers and nervous laughter, they didn't describe the man's face. They couldn't recall his words, his weeping, his fall to the knees. They remembered the pig, the way it stood, the way its eyes didn't dart or plead or search the ceiling for angels. They remembered how it held its ground, not out of courage, but because it didn't know how else to stand. And maybe that's what made them remember. Because somewhere deep inside them, beneath the weight of ritual and righteousness, they knew. One of them went to the rope with dignity. And it wasn't the one who had a name. The smell that stayed in the courthouse. It wasn't the kind of stench you could scrub away with vinegar or prayer. It clung. It didn't just settle into wood, it became part of it. The magistrates noticed first. Of course they did. Their shoes were new, their robes perfumed with rosemary or pressed lavender from a priest's garden. Their world was scented with things that didn't remind them of the ground. So when your trial ended and the bailiff led you out, tethered and trembling, they thought that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. By nightfall, the room still pulsed with the smell of you. Not just pig, though, that would have been insult enough, but of earth, straw, cold skin, fear, of blood diluted in muddy water, of oil that had once touched leather, now caught in your bristles. They tried to name it, called it animal, called it waste, called it sin. They were wrong. It wasn't you. Not entirely. What stayed behind wasn't just a scent, but a residue. A kind of moral damp that soaked into the stone walls and made the candles flicker for reasons no one admitted. The judge ordered the floors swept, twice. A priest waved incense until he choked. They opened every window, but the wind brought in more silence than air. And still it stayed. Someone suggested salt. Another, fire. They considered moving the trials to the chapel, but no one wanted that smell in the place where bread became body. One clerk whispered, "It's not the pig. It's what we did to the pig." That clerk was reassigned. But others felt it too. A sourness beneath the tongue when they recited verdicts. A dryness in the throat when they passed sentence on people who still had names. They couldn't say why. Only that justice felt heavier now, less clean, as if their own breath might betray them, carry the scent forward. They stopped speaking about you. Officially, you became an anecdote, then a warning, then a ghost. But the odor never quite faded. Even the rain didn't lift it. Even the summer heat just made it worse. Thick, humid, clinging to every robe and scroll and oath. Because it wasn't about the trial anymore. It was about the question they'd left hanging in the rafters like a noose half-tied. What if we judged the wrong creature? What if the beast had been outside the pen? What if the grunts weren't defiance, but confusion? What if it wasn't justice they'd performed, but fear draped in Latin and sealed with wax? That question stank worse than any pig, worse than any crime. It lingered behind every syllable of guilty. It pulsed beneath every signature. It followed them home, in their sleeves and their hair and their dreams. And long after the trial was forgotten, after the rope was reused, the wood repainted, the records shelved, the smell remained. A reminder that some truths, once inhaled, can never be exhaled again. The piglet born the next day. The ground was still damp from yesterday's verdict. Mud hadn't dried, the rope still swayed faintly in the breeze, and the air, though scrubbed with smoke and hymns, hadn't yet lost its weight. But somewhere beyond the edge of the village, tucked behind a leaning barn with a roof that forgot how to hold its shape, life did what life always does after men have tried to end it. It began again. A sow groaned softly beneath a curtain of flies, her body shivering with instinct. No ceremony, no sermon. Just a new shape pressing into the world, slick with breath and possibility. A piglet, small enough to fit in a palm, too pink, too new, the kind of creature that shouldn't exist after a week like that. And yet, there it was, squirming, blinking, blindly nosing toward milk. The midwife, who'd helped more babies than pigs in her time, muttered without looking up. Look, even after all that, they return. She didn't mean resurrection. She meant defiance. She meant continuity. Some overheard her and crossed themselves. Some looked to the sky, expecting thunder, but most didn't know what to think. Was it a sign that forgiveness had already forgotten them? That judgment, for all its pageantry, couldn't hold back the simplest force in the world birth? Or was it irony? A cruel, cosmic wink? That in less than 24 hours, the very species they'd condemned to death for daring to live by its nature had dared again? The villagers watched the piglet grow. It didn't look like you, but some said it did. Some swore its eyes were the same, too wide, too knowing. Others said it squealed at the priest once, and he dropped his candle. But the piglet didn't know about gallows or verdicts or notaries with tired hands. It knew warmth. It knew mud. It knew that when it cried, someone answered. It suckled with abandon. It slept in tight spirals. It squealed whenever the world was too much, which was often. And all the while the village whispered. Some saw it as grace, that even in judgment the world offers softness. Others saw it as a warning that even in new life, old crimes might return. But the piglet didn't carry any of that. Not yet. It didn't know that one day a child might reach too far into its pen, that a startled nip might be called malice, that hunger could be mistaken for cruelty, that instinct could be interpreted as defiance, that one twitch too sudden might turn it from beast to symbol, from squeal to sentence. It didn't know that one day it might be asked to stand, not as a creature, but as an idea in a room full of robes and rope. It didn't know the name you were never given, but it lived inside the same story. And for now, that was enough. It lived, and that, in itself, was an act louder than any verdict. The barn where they whispered about you. Long after your trial, the barn still held your story. The wooden slats might have been replaced, the straw swept and burned, but nothing removed the shape you left behind. People avoided that corner. Not openly, no one believed in haunted pigs, not officially. But when children ran past, someone always called them back. And if they asked why, the answer came as a shrug, or a cough, or just silence, wrapped in a too tight smile. The space stayed empty, not by rule but by instinct, as if the ground itself had memory, as if dust, once settled in fear, knew how to resist change. It wasn't that you were dangerous. It was that you were remembered, and memory, especially the kind tied to shame, seeps into the beams and boards and refuses to rot away. They whispered that your bite had been intentional, that your eyes darkened the moment before it happened, that you hadn't squealed, not even when they dragged you to judgment. And the more they repeated it, the more true it sounded to them. But you, in truth, had done nothing special that morning, nothing violent, nothing different. You chewed on a stalk of something bitter. You rolled onto your side. You blinked at the clouds the way animals do when they haven't yet learned the weight of guilt. But that's the thing about innocence. It's too quiet to defend itself. And in the absence of screams or protest, people fill the silence with stories, with legends, with whispered warnings passed on like bedtime tales turned inside out. And speaking of bedtime tales, the next one has lace, linen, and a bonnet that never asked to be tied under your chin. When pigs were dressed like people before death, it began with the bonnet. Someone, likely the midwife, or maybe the woman who washed linens for the chapel, brought it out, folded like an offering. Pale blue, trimmed with lace, still smelling faintly of milk and dried lavender. It was tied under your chin, with hands that shook only a little. The shirt came next small, stiff, never meant for flesh like yours. And finally, a coat, too large in the shoulders, but close enough to imply something grotesque, that this wasn't just an execution, but a mirror, a mockery of what had been lost. They said it was for solemnity, for closure, to make the villagers remember the child. But memory is not healed by costumes, and your hooves didn't fit the sleeves. Your snout pushed against the collar, damp with breath. You twitched beneath the weight of unfamiliar fabric, confused not by the rope you'd smelled rope before, but by the reverence, the silence, the way the crowd looked at you not with hatred, but with something worse. Expectation. You were no longer simply a pig. You were a symbol now, a vessel for grief too large to carry alone, a thing they could hang instead of asking harder questions. How had the child gotten into the pen? Why had no one watched him? Who had forgotten the latch? None of that mattered anymore. What mattered was the coat, the bonnet, the illusion that the world had balance, that for every life lost, one must be paid in kind, even if that life didn't speak, or kneel, or sin. Even the butcher, the man who had once fed you, once scratched behind your ear absent-mindedly, wouldn't meet your eyes. He held the knife low, not because he was afraid you'd run, but because he couldn't bring himself to lift it higher. When the deed was done, they removed the clothes before disposal, washed them, dried them in sun and prayer. They were folded and stored in a chest labeled Sacred Cloths. And you became part of a story they only told after dusk. But lace can't soften a verdict, and linen doesn't fit regret. When you were meat again, there is no applause, no crowd, no dramatic bell, just a dull morning behind the mill and a silence that hums like resignation. After everything, the stairs, the trial, the robe-clad accusations, they do not let your body rest. They do not grant you the mercy of rot or memory. They butcher you slowly, deliberately. No sermon, no speech, only hands that once condemned you now moving with cold efficiency, carving what they called sin into usefulness. You're not sold as food. Of course not. You're unclean. The label lingers like a stain, but your body finds new life in quiet, unspoken ways. Your fat is rendered into grease for lanterns. Your hide becomes stiff leather. Your hooves vanish into the tanner's trade, turned into glue or buttons or tools. Every part of you repurposed, not remembered, not mourned. There's something brutal in that transition. From soul-bearing criminal to commodity, from courtroom spectacle to nameless parts spread across the village, and no one speaks of it, because silence is safer. It keeps the illusion that justice was served cleanly, without leftovers. The same ones who watched your execution now boil your marrow with the same hands they used to point. And yet, somewhere deep in the fibers of the rope that held you and now holds something else entirely, a small whisper remains. Not loud enough to change anything. Just enough to remind someone somewhere that you were more than meat, if only for a moment, if only long enough to bleed. The pig who learned to be quiet. After everything, the trial, the sentence, the way they looked at you like you were a symbol of sin in a snout, you stopped making noise. You didn't mean to. It wasn't a choice. It was something deeper. Something that curled up inside you and went still. The first few days after the accusation, you still grunted when you were hungry, squealed when you were stepped on. But the grunts got shorter. The squeals faded into throatier huffs. By the end of the week, you were silent. The farmer noticed, said you'd gone strange, called you cursed, poked your ribs with a stick and muttered about the devil's silence. But you weren't cursed. You were careful. Every sound a pig makes is a gamble now. A grunt can be misread. A squeal might be heard as defiance. Even rooting your snout through straw too aggressively could be mistaken for rage. So, you learned stillness. The kind of stillness only fear teaches. A practiced invisibility, like a stone at the edge of the pen, like an afterthought. Some days, children still came to watch, but you didn't move, not even when they threw beats. You weren't trying to make a statement. You were just surviving the only way left. Because in a world where noise could be taken as guilt, silence became your only defense. And so, while others forgot your name, the one you never had, you became something else. A creature shaped by caution. A body holding its breath forever. And speaking of forgotten names, the boy who fed you never asked for yours either, but he remembered your hunger. Let's talk about him next. The boy who fed you in secret. He was small, all elbows and urgency, with a face always slightly too red from running or shame or both. No one paid him much mind, the youngest of 4, always trailing behind someone else's shadow. But he saw you. From behind fences, through gaps in the thatch, across courtyards where others only saw straw and stink, he saw something else. A creature that needed feeding. And so, he fed you. First, it was crusts, then softened apples, then a heel of bread saved from his own plate. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't look for thanks. He just tossed the food gently, without words, and walked away fast, like kindness was a secret he had to keep from himself. You learned his steps the way his boots dragged slightly on the left, the way he breathed through his mouth when he was nervous. You never grunted when he came. That was the deal. He fed you. You stayed quiet. One day, he brought cheese. Just a sliver, wrapped in a leaf. His hand came too close. You didn't bite, but your snout brushed his fingers, and he flinched. Not in fear. In recognition. He met your eyes. And for the first time, you understood what humans must mean when they talk about souls. Later that week, when they came to move you for the trial, he wasn't there. His brother said he had a fever. Or maybe he just knew what was coming. Maybe he'd fed too many creatures too close to the end. Maybe he was tired of pretending that kindness didn't hurt. But you remembered him not just the food, but the silence. The way he fed you like someone who believed that mercy didn't need to be loud. And long after the trial, long after the rope and the crowd and the cold, damp silence of a vanished name, you still carried the echo of his steps. And if we're going to talk about echoes, then next we should talk about the pig who spoke in dreams. Because silence doesn't always mean stillness, not where the past keeps whispering. The pig who spoke in dreams. They say pigs don't dream, that sleep is just darkness between meals. But they're wrong. In that small pen behind the church, beneath straw that scratched more than it warmed, your eyes would close, and something softer would begin. You dreamed in snorts and shadow. Not words, not colors, but memory rearranged. The boy with the red scarf would appear, older, quieter, holding not food but silence cupped in his palms like water. You never saw his mouth move, but you heard him anyway. He asked if you were sorry. He asked if you remembered. And then he didn't ask anything at all. Just stood there, watching, as if waiting for you to speak. And in the dream, you did. You told him about the child, about the scent of berries, the sound of laughter, the blur between curiosity and hunger. You told him how quick it all happened, how slow the guilt settled. You told him how loneliness clings tighter than mud, how you missed the sound of footsteps that weren't coming to tie a rope. You told him you didn't mean to become a story. In the waking world, no one knew. You grunted, and they heard mockery. You squealed, and they heard guilt. But in sleep, in the warm flicker of imagined straw and memory that doesn't ache, you had a voice. And maybe that's why you slept so often near the end. Not from exhaustion, but from longing. Because the only courtroom where you were understood was the one inside your skull. But not all dreams are gentle, especially when pigs begin to see the fire being built. So let's follow that smoke into the next tale when even death wasn't enough to stop the ritual. The pig who never did anything wrong. Some lives pass like smoke through the rafters, thin, unbothered, unspectacular, and some pigs are born into those lives. They grunt politely at feeding time. They roll just enough in the mud to cool the skin, not enough to stain the air. They never nip at fingers, never knock over buckets, never draw the eye of man or God. And because of that, they're allowed to disappear quietly from birth to butcher in a single, uneventful breath, forgotten before the knife even cools. But not you. You were born ordinary. Nothing special in the curl of your tail, the rhythm of your breath. Yet somehow, you ended up here behind bars of rope and ritual, beneath the heavy breath of suspicion. You didn't ask for it. You didn't seek attention. You only did what you always did. Smelled, chewed, explored, until one moment, one crack in the pattern became a verdict. A child cried. A woman screamed. And your name or the grunt they mistook for one was dragged into meaning. Suddenly, your snout was a weapon, your hunger an offense, the rhythm of your chewing, a declaration of guilt. You weren't more dangerous than the pigs who lived and died in silence, just easier to blame. Because humans need reasons. They need stories to explain their fear. And when the world slips, they search for a scapegoat with bristles. You became the shape their guilt fit best into. The symbol of a truth they didn't want to admit. That danger isn't always in the fangs sometimes. It's just in the timing. And that's the cruelty no rope can correct. Not that you did something wrong, but that you didn't. That you were punished not for crime, but for being noticed. Of course, not all pigs go to trial. Some are burned. Which leads us, predictably, to the next flame-lit spectacle, because even the dead apparently need to be taught a lesson. A death sentence spoken in Latin. They gathered in the square as if called by bells, though none had rung. The air was heavy, thick with the damp breath of a dozen unspoken thoughts. You were there, tethered by something rougher than rope, the weight of unfamiliar eyes, the hush before judgment. A man in robes opened a book, not a ledger, not a list of feed or births, but a sacred tome, the kind bound in leather and lined with silence. He cleared his throat and began to speak, not to you, not to them, to something older than both. The words were Latin, long and stern, with rhythms made for stone walls and vaulted ceilings. You didn't understand them, of course. You didn't need to. They weren't for comprehension. They were for effect, for power, for making a pig's death sound like a necessary act of divine bureaucracy. The crowd didn't follow either. They shifted, muttered. A child leaned close to her mother's side. A man adjusted his hat, then removed it. Somewhere, a rooster crowed, confused by the lack of dawn. You stood still, not because you were noble, but because fear doesn't always twitch. Sometimes it roots, anchors you to the straw and filth and fading sun. The voice kept going, crisp, beautiful even, like music made of knives. Every sentence ended like a door closing. Every breath carried the cold of a room you were not invited into. And then it stopped. The priest shut his book. The judge did not meet your eyes. No one clapped, no one cried, but something shifted. The rope tightened, not around your neck yet, but around your future. Because that was the real trick of the Latin. It didn't need to be translated. It just needed to be said. But if the sentence was sacred, the next step was not. Justice, apparently, required spectacle and fire. Always fire. The woman who said nothing. She stood at the edge of the crowd, neither near nor far, wrapped in a shawl that had known too many seasons. Her face was unreadable. Not stone, not sorrow, just absence. The kind of face you learn to wear when the world has already taken something from you, and you're waiting for it to try again. She had seen everything. The child, curious and soft-footed, toddling toward your pen. The playful grunt you gave, the one that meant nothing. The stumble, the scream, the panic that bloomed like rot in the air. But when they asked for witnesses, she looked at her shoes. When the priest summoned the righteous, she tightened her shawl. And when the judge asked if any soul would speak for the accused beast or otherwise, she kept her lips sealed like a secret passed down from mother to daughter. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't vengeance. It was something colder. Survival. Her child had died weeks before, not from violence, but from fever. A quiet, drawn-out vanishing. No trial. No justice. Just a grave dug before the sun rose. And in her silence, she found a kind of shelter. A grief that couldn't bear more noise. Or perhaps a selfish clarity. Someone else's pain would shield her from her own. Years passed. Seasons blurred. And one day, she entered the chapel with shaking hands and hollow eyes. Sat before the priest and wept like her bones had cracked. Said your eyes had not been cruel. Said the child had fallen. Said you'd been blamed because you were there, and nothing else made sense. The priest gave her words of absolution. Said God understood. Said confession cleanses. But the village didn't hear that part. The story remained as it always had. A beast judged, a child lost, a punishment served. Only her nights changed. The dreams, the sweating, the shape of your snout in her memory, hovering not with menace but confusion, and in that confusion the unbearable truth. She had watched the lie grow, had watered it with her silence, and every time someone told the tale of the trial, she looked away, not because it was painful, but because she remembered that you had looked back at her and trusted her just once, just long enough to be betrayed by it. The pig who didn't run. It creaked open at dawn, just a whisper of wood on frost. The latch dangled loose, swaying with the same breeze that rustled the straw. You saw it. You smelled it. A sliver of space that meant freedom, or something like it. Beyond that narrow gate, there were no ropes, no stairs, no sermons in languages made of stone. Just the thick scent of trees, and wet soil, and the distant sound of hooves not yet hunted. And still, you didn't move. Your legs twitched, your ribs tightened, but you didn't step forward. Because everything you knew, every grunt, every mealtime, every slap, every hour beneath a sky just out of reach had happened within the 4 crooked planks that made up your world. The pen didn't hold you. Familiarity did. The villagers came later, found you lying in the same spot, still, watching the open gate like a puzzle you never asked to solve. They saw obedience. They saw confession in your posture, resignation in your silence. One man nodded, as if your stillness proved something profound about guilt. But you weren't guilty, or innocent. You were terrified. Because the unknown is not freedom. Not when you've been raised in routine. Not when even cruelty has a schedule. Not when the scent of pine feels more threatening than the sound of chains. Outside the fence, everything smelled bigger, too big to trust. And somewhere deep in your gut, you knew. They might hang you. They might slice you open and pretend it was justice. But at least you'd understand that death. You didn't stay because you were brave. You stayed because you didn't know what leaving would taste like. And so, they called you tame, called you faithful, said you knew your place. But what they missed was the saddest truth of all. You weren't choosing to die. You simply didn't know what it meant to live. A crime, repeated by every pig that followed. They buried your memory in silence, but not in forgetfulness. The rope that once held your neck became a template. The pen you stood in became a blueprint. and your final breath sharp, wet, thick with confusion, echoed longer than anyone dared to admit. You didn't leave behind a body mourned or a name chiseled into wood, but you left a precedent. From then on, every pig was suspect. Mothers pulled their children back at the sight of a snout. Fathers built pens with sharper corners, higher fences, and stronger locks. The village changed. Not because it healed from your supposed sin, but because it feared its repetition. You became a warning, whispered at dusk, a sermon folded into supper conversation. Watch them. They remember blood. Of course. You hadn't remembered anything of the sort. You were just hungry, curious, startled maybe. But the myth grew larger than your actions ever were. Soon, the mere flick of a tail near a toddler drew stares. A misplaced grunt earned a priest's muttered Latin. Fear thickened around pigs like smoke, and suspicion settled in their straw before they even learned to walk. And so it happened. Again and again. One squealed too loud. One nipped too fast. One rooted too close to a cradle. And with each accusation, the villagers invoked your story, not with reverence, but with routine. Another trial. Another rope. Another pig marched through mud beneath a sky too vast for justice. The cycle turned. They didn't know your face. They didn't remember your gait or your breath or the way you flinched at the clang of iron, but they remembered the shape of the fear you left behind. And in remembering that, they kept you alive, not as a creature, not even as a cautionary tale, but as a symbol, a mark etched into the slow machinery of rural judgment. You weren't the first to be blamed, and you weren't the last, but you were the one they measured the others against, the one who turned a single accident into a tradition of trials. And in that cruel repetition, in that ritual passed down like recipe or superstition, you became what few pigs ever do: eternal, the scribe who drew your face in the margins. He sat hunched for hours, that monk candlelight flickering on vellum, quill scratching like footsteps over stone. His task was sacred: copy the laws, the cases, the judgments of the realm. But boredom crept into even the most divine hands. And somewhere between a trial for a man who stole bread and a decree about boundary stones, he drew you. It wasn't art, just a few curved lines. A pig, no bigger than a thumbprint, shackled legs, slumped back, a drooping snout. Around you, he scrawled a tiny gallows, a judge's raised hand, a cross. Above it all, the scales tilted, of course, like they always were. He didn't name you, no one ever did, but he gave you something rarer than justice: attention. Not the kind that mocks or punishes, the kind that notices, the kind that sees you for more than your snout and your sentence. And when he finished, he didn't scratch it out. He didn't hide it. He left it there just beside the margin, tucked between law and prayer, as if to say, this happened too. Years turned the page brittle. Dust softened the ink. The world moved on, forgot. Monks died and scribes changed, and libraries were built and burned and rebuilt again. But that margin, that quiet rebellion in black and brown, survived, until one day a scholar flipped through the manuscript, searching for feudal tax records, and saw your face. At first, he laughed. Of course he did. A pig on trial? Ridiculous. Absurd. But then he took a picture, saved it, labeled it, maybe even wrote an article. And suddenly, there you were again, not in the straw of your pen or the noose of your ending, but in pixels, in print. A pig remembered not for guilt or gore, but for how someone once bothered to draw your sadness. That scribe never knew his doodle would outlive kingdoms, that centuries later, your image would float through the minds of strangers not as a beast, not even as a warning, but as a question. What kind of justice draws its victims in chains? And what kind of justice forgets them? Except in the margins. When you became a warning in the Psalms. It was Sunday, or whatever passed for Sunday, in a village where the sky dictated time more than bells. The chapel was full. Damp cloaks hung at the entrance, and the benches groaned under the weight of bodies and breath. Children fidgeted, elders dozed, and the preacher, robes heavy with dust and power, opened his book. Not the Bible. Not yet. First, a story, a parable, one not found in Scripture, but in memory. He told of a pig, not by name. You never had one, just the pig. A beast once trusted, fed by hand, lulled into a pen like any other, but then a bite, a scream, blood in the straw, a child gone. A trial held, a sentence passed, justice done. The preacher's voice rose. Even the dumb creatures fall to darkness. Even the lowest of beasts may harbor sin. Let us not be like the pig, heedless, soulless, wild. People nodded. Some crossed themselves. A mother pulled her child a little closer, and there it was, your legacy, laid out in syllables and silence. Not a body in the ground, not even a memory in the mouths of those who fed you. Just a fable, a warning stitched into the Psalms like a weed among wheat. They didn't speak of your eyes, or your confusion, or the way you stood still when they tied the rope. No one remembered the boy who used to feed you, or the scribe who drew you, or the monk who prayed for your soul. Those were too soft for sermons. Instead, you became shorthand, a tool, a moral turning point, proof that evil could exist even in snouts and hooves, and that if even pigs could fall, then so could men. It made them feel safe, somehow, to believe your death had meaning, but you never asked to mean anything. And maybe that's the final cruelty worse than the trial, the rope, the silence afterward. To have your life, your death, your fear repurposed, not remembered, not mourned, just used, hollowed into a metaphor and marched out beside Scripture, a shadow standing in for sin. You were not evil. You were not wild. You were hungry, startled, alive. But now you're a verse in someone else's psalm, and that, somehow, lasts longer than you ever did. The pig who heard his eulogy. It was over quickly, and yet it stretched beyond time. The rope had done its work. The crowd, once hushed and hungry for justice, now lingered in uncertain silence. A few shuffled their feet. A child sniffled. Someone cleared their throat. The executioner stepped back as if he'd spilled something, not taken a life. Your body hung, but it wasn't the weight that unsettled them. It was the absence of noise. No final squeal. No struggle. Just stillness. And in that stillness, something unexpected happened. The priest, an old man with brittle hands and a spine like a question mark, stepped forward. Maybe it was instinct, maybe ritual, or maybe, in that moment, he couldn't remember if silence was enough. He opened his book. Not the court ledger, but the one meant for grace, the one with worn pages that smelled of wax and breath. He didn't read long, just a few lines, something meant for comfort, not for pigs, for people, but the air held it all the same. You didn't understand the words, Latin likely, or some crumbling version of it, but the rhythm that was familiar, the way his voice dipped and rose, slow and steady, like a lullaby stitched into rain. It was the voice humans used when cradling infants, when watching wagons disappear into war, when kneeling at graves with no flowers left to offer. The crowd didn't laugh. They didn't interrupt. They just listened. And for a fleeting instant, they forgot that you weren't supposed to matter. It was not an official eulogy, not recorded in any book, not a sermon they'd repeat, but it was real. A murmur carved from guilt and routine, delivered not to honor, but to soften the edges of what they had done. And somehow, it reached you, not in your ears, now useless, but in the space you left behind, in the straw where your body once warmed the earth, in the air that cooled too quickly, in the quiet gasp that someone just one let slip before turning away. For a creature denied a soul, for a life weighed only in blame, the moment held something you were never supposed to receive. Not forgiveness, not understanding, but reverence slight and strange and fleeting like a final breath whispered through stained glass. They said pigs could not receive prayer, and yet that day one did. The bones buried without blessing. They did not light a pyre for you. No oil-soaked cloth, no final flame. Yours was not a death fit for purification. You were not elevated to smoke or allowed the cleansing of fire. Instead, they chose dirt hurried, careless dirt. A hole behind the stables where waste goes, where dead chickens are tossed, where no one lingers. They lowered your body without ceremony, not with ropes, not with care. Just a shove, a slump, a dull thud against soil. Someone muttered a line about keeping dogs away. Another said, "Don't let the children see." But none of them looked too long. By then, your wait had already begun to mean nothing. There was no prayer, no incense, not even the mockery of a cross made of sticks, just shovels, just silence, just the scraping sound of earth reclaiming flesh it never asked for. Later that week, the dogs came, not out of mourning, but out of curiosity. They sniffed, scratched, dug a little, then wandered off, tails limp, as if even they sensed something wrong, not the death, but the neglect, the absence of anything sacred. The villagers speak of it in hushed tones now. That patch behind the stable, the one that won't grow. They pretend it's the shade, or the soil, or superstition, but they avoid it. They walk around it with baskets of grain, with buckets of water, with children in tow. They lower their voices when the wind passes through that part of the yard too fast. And then there's the strange part, the part no one admits aloud. Sometimes something breaks through the ground there, not a tree, not wheat, something pale, crooked, thin as a wrist, sharp at the ends, not bone, not branch. They dig it up, burn it, bury it again deeper, and still it returns. They don't say your name, you never had one, but they remember the grunt, the trial, the rope, the stench, the priest's silence, the boy's whisper. They remember the hunger that was never satisfied, the judgment that never felt just, and the ground that refuses to forget. No cross marks you. No blessing seals you. You were buried as waste. But the earth perhaps remembers better than men do. And in that remembering, something grows. Not justice, not forgiveness, but something that reminds them that no death, no matter how unloved, disappears without leaving a shadow, especially not one buried without a name. The farmer who missed you in silence. He never named you, never scratched your back like he did the dog, never spoke to you except in commands, sharp, clipped, practical. But he noticed when your ear tore on the fence. He saw when your gait limped after a frost. And once, during spring melt, when the stream ran fast and the banks turned to soup, he waded in up to his knees to pull you out, muttering curses the whole time, but holding you firm with both arms. He didn't cry when they took you, didn't plead, didn't shout, just stood there with mud on his boots and breath clouding in the morning air, watching as the rope looped around your neck. He told the magistrate, quietly, in his own way, that you weren't dangerous, that pigs bite sometimes, sure, but not like that, not with hate, not with intention. He said you spooked easy, that the child had startled you, that maybe it was no one's fault, that maybe they were asking a question the world didn't need answered. But the judge had already made up his mind. So had the priest. The farmer wasn't important enough to change anything. Just another man with calloused hands and no Latin in his mouth. Now the pen stands empty. The straw is still there, faded, flattened, oddly untouched. Sometimes a chicken wanders in and leaves again quickly, as if sensing the space isn't theirs. The trough is dry. The fence leans a little more each week. Still, he doesn't fix it. When he passes, he doesn't linger. That would be weakness. He just walks slower for those few steps. His head dips, not in shame, not in prayer, just the way it dips when you carry something heavier than your arms can show. He spits, always at the same spot. Not like clearing his throat, but like releasing something stuck in it, something sour, something tight. The villagers think he's moved on, that pigs come and go. That loss like that doesn't sink deep. But they don't see the way he cuts the carrots now, a little thinner. How he counts the piglets twice instead of once. How he doesn't let the new ones near the fence when children visit. He never tells the new farmhand your story, doesn't mention the trial, doesn't explain why that pen stays empty. But every so often, at dusk, when the sky bleeds and the birds quiet, he stands by the gate a few seconds longer than he should. He doesn't say sorry. Pigs don't get apologies, but they do get silence. And sometimes, that's the closest thing a man can give. When the village laughed about you too loud, it didn't happen right away. At first, your story was told in whispers, in corners, in the back pews after Mass. Cautious words, sentences broken with glances. But time has a way of softening fear into amusement, or at least into something people can carry without guilt. And so, over months and seasons, your name, or the absence of it, became a punchline. In the tavern, it always started the same way. A cup clinks. A story stumbles out about a pig, about a trial, about a noose tied with more ceremony than sense. Someone mimics your squeal. Someone else grunts in mock defense. "Your Honor," one man bellows, slapping the table. "I was framed," and everyone laughs. Big, open-mouthed, sloppy laughter. The kind that echoes off wooden beams and makes people feel close, safe, clean. But there's a brittleness in it, because buried beneath that laughter is something no one wants to touch. The knowledge that they did it. that they watched, that they let it happen, that a pig was tried as if he knew law and punished as if he chose violence. They laugh harder the more ale is poured. The louder the fire pops, the more outrageous the reenactments become. Someone stands on a bench and delivers the fake verdict again. Someone else throws a crust of bread at their feet. Justice served. But every now and then, the joke misfires. Like the night old Thomas leaned back in his chair and muttered, too clearly. We all knew it wasn't the pig's fault. The room didn't fall silent, not completely. A cough, a creak, the scrape of a stool. But the warmth dropped out of the air like breath from a wound. No one looked at Thomas. He didn't say more. Just sipped his drink like it might swallow his words. And no one argued with him. The conversation shifted. Back to crops. To the mill's broken wheel. To the priest's new boots. But the laughter didn't return that night. Not really. It tried in small bursts, forced and fleeting, but it couldn't climb over what had just been said. Because that's the thing about jokes. They're armor until they aren't. They protect until someone pokes through. And after that, they hurt. So now, your story lives in chuckles, in slurred memories, in reenactments where men pretend to be pigs and pigs pretend to understand their fate. But beneath the laughter, always beneath it, something else stirs. A question, a chill, a memory of a rope that didn't quite make sense. And in that space between the grin and the guilt, you live on. Not as justice, not as joke, but as the moment the village laughed too loudly and heard itself echo back something it didn't expect. The piglet who looked just like you. The thaw came early that year, softening the soil into a wet kind of promise. Birds returned, cautiously, testing the branches with light feet and lighter songs. And in the pen behind the stable, a sow gave birth. 7 piglets, each slick and trembling, rooting blindly for warmth. But one made the air change. It wasn't anything dramatic. No thunder. No omen scrawled in wind. Just a silence that fell the moment that one emerged. Its fur marked with the same uneven dark splotches, the same faint arch in the spine, and the same eyes. Not quite black, not quite brown, just familiar. The midwife didn't scream. She didn't gasp or run. She froze, knees bent, arms covered in birth-stained cloth. And then, slowly, she reached for a scrap of red thread, the kind used to mend sleeves or mark jars, and tied it gently around the piglet's back leg. A bracelet of memory. A silent flag. She didn't explain why. She didn't need to. The stable boy saw it. The farmer's wife, too. And by dusk, the story had passed like smoke through the village. A piglet born in spring with the same face as the one they hanged last year. No one said reincarnation. That was for monks and drunks, but everyone thought it. And more than one old woman muttered a prayer when they walked by the pen, fingers twitching at their rosary, as if to keep the boundary between past and present from fraying. The piglet was healthy, curious, playful. It suckled with vigor, rolled in mud, snorted at shadows. It did everything piglets do, but it did it under the weight of a gaze. Because no matter how young it was, how innocent, how unaware of the rope or the trial or the cloak of blame once wrapped around another back, it was watched. The red thread never came off, not even when it outgrew it. The farmer replaced it with a longer strip, said it helped him tell them apart. But it wasn't for him. It was for the villagers. They never named it. They never let children feed it scraps. And when the boy with the red scarf reached out one day, his mother slapped his hand without thinking and dragged him back to the house, whispering something about lessons that shouldn't be forgotten. The piglet grew, larger than expected, stronger too. It lived longer than the other one, saw more seasons, ate better, was spared the usual fate, again and again, for reasons no one ever explained, not even to themselves. But freedom was not forgiveness. Longevity was not love, because it never knew the joy of a careless touch, the squeal of a child unafraid, the peace of existing without metaphor. It was not punished, no, but it was not allowed to be only what it was. And in that way, it carried your sentence forward, not in flesh, but in shadow. A piglet, born in spring, marked not by what it did, but by who it resembled, watched not for danger, but for history. And that red thread, still tied around its leg, fluttered in the breeze like a whisper of something too painful to name and too familiar to ignore. The scroll where your crime was recorded. It was never meant to be poetry. No flourish of calligraphy, no grand border of gold leaf or saints. Just a scroll brittle, dust-laced, tucked into a chest that smelled like wet parchment and old iron. They kept it with records of debts, of marriages, of frost that came too soon, or calves that were stillborn. Your story sat between those mundane tragedies like a splinter in wood, small, but sharp enough to ache. "Item," it began, in that stiff, clerical tone that promises order and delivers forgetting. "On the 3rd day of Lent, a swine was tried and found guilty of blood crime against the innocent. Sentence: death by rope. Nothing else. No name. No sketch. No description of the wind that morning, or the whisper that passed through the village before the trial began. No record of your eyes, or your hunger, or the sound you made when the rope touched your neck. They didn't record the child's laughter before the scream. They didn't note the way your body trembled, not with rage, but with confusion. They didn't mention the priest who crossed himself 3 times more than usual, or the child who hid behind his mother's skirts, clutching a crust of bread and watching you like a question no one wanted to answer. They didn't write that the village dogs barked the whole time, sensing something wrong in the rhythm of justice. That someone in the crowd whispered, "It's only a pig." Or that someone else replied, "Not today." Instead, they wrote a sentence shorter than your tale, less forgiving than your breath, a line that could be copied easily by monks who never smelled the trial, by scholars who would someday marvel at the absurdity of it all, sipping tea in rooms warmed by stoves and untroubled by hunger. And centuries later, that scroll would surface in a book footnoted, cited, chuckled over, displayed in glass, evidence, they'd call it, of how law reached even the barnyard, of how civilization demanded order. A pig, judged, executed, remembered only through ink, but not remembered really. Not you, just the event, the shape of it, the strangeness. No one wrote that you were fed turnip peels by a boy in a red scarf. No one noted the warmth in the stable that winter. The way your sisters huddled around you, believing with pig-hearted certainty that nothing could go so wrong in a world that smelled of hay and hands. Instead, your name became a swine. Your life reduced to grammar, a scribble between lines. And if the scroll survives long after your bones have turned to dust, it will not carry your truth. It will carry their idea of you trimmed, filed, flattened, justice, signed, and sealed. But you? You lived it. Every grunt, every step, every silence between the spoken words. They wrote a sentence, but you served it. When pigs stopped being judged and just got slaughtered, there was a time when a pig could stand trial, when ropes were measured like riddles, when magistrates quoted scripture over straw-stained pens, and priests muttered Latin at animals that never prayed back. That time passed quietly. No decree announced its end. No bell rang to mark the final case. It faded like fog over pasture, like a superstition that outgrew itself. Eventually, the trial stopped. No more court scribes pausing to note a snort. No more pigs in bonnets facing crowds that didn't know whether to laugh or kneel. The performance grew tiresome, too costly, too slow, too full of contradictions that made certain minds itch. Why try a pig when the verdict was always the same? Why argue intent to a creature who never knew what intent meant? They went back to what was simpler. Slaughter. Done before dawn. Quick, wet, without robes, without crowds, without guilt. A man with a knife, a trough beneath the neck, a grunt, then silence. That was it. That was the justice pigs would get from then on. No stories, no scrolls, no absurd dignity born of accusation. Just meat, and the industry of hunger. Strangely, they called it progress. They said it was efficiency, that the world had become more practical, more rational. But underneath that, clean logic was something far less noble, a refusal to look, to wonder, to remember that, once, they treated pigs like people, that they stood in courts and tied little garments on animals, and told themselves it was moral clarity. After you, no pig was judged again. You were the last to stand, not as livestock, but as defendant, to be seen grotesquely, absurdly, as a moral being, capable of evil, capable of punishment, capable of being wrong in a way that required ritual. And then it stopped. The next pig died without a trial. No child whispered blessings. No priest flinched. No scroll was inked with guilt. Just blade, blood, fire, bone. The village ate, wiped their mouths, and moved on. In that silence, you vanished. Not just you, but everything they projected onto you. Fear, blame, authority dressed as ceremony. The illusion that the world made sense if everyone, even animals, were held accountable. That illusion collapsed when they realized what they'd been doing. And they replaced it with a simpler one. That pigs were never anything but meat. They stopped accusing, but they also stopped seeing. No longer beasts of judgment, no longer mirrors of sin. Just silent, just food, and the strange, cruel dignity they gave you, even in error, was buried with the last of your kind, to be sentenced, not slaughtered. They say that forgetting is cleaner than forgiving, and silence, after all, is easier to swallow. The child who asked, "But what did the pig say?" Years later, when the trial is long faded into the parchment of parish ledgers and the laughter of tavern tales, your story resurfaces in a classroom, not as tragedy, not as cruelty, as curiosity wrapped in lesson. The teacher stands before the children, chalk in hand, voice dancing somewhere between fable and fact. She tells of a time when pigs were tried like men. She describes the rope, the priest, the crowd. How the law once spoke to bristles and snouts as if they understood. The children giggle. Of course they do. It's absurd. A pig in a courtroom? A pig with a lawyer? A pig in a bonnet? Laughter is easier than reckoning. But one child doesn't laugh. She sits near the window, face half lit by gray sky. Her hand rises slow, small, not shy, just certain. And she asks the question no one else thought to ask. But what did the pig say? The room stills. The teacher blinks, pauses, caught, briefly, in the impossible weight of the question. She tries to smile, to fold the moment back into the lesson, to regain her footing. Pigs don't talk, she says, gently, practiced, like closing a book before the last page is read. The others return to their notebooks. They doodle pigs with powdered wigs. They whisper oinks between giggles. The story has passed its moment. But the girl, she doesn't turn back. She keeps staring out the window, past the playground, past the hedge, toward the hill where fog gathers like old secrets. She doesn't believe in talking pigs. Not exactly. But she knows silence can mean something. That not speaking doesn't mean not feeling. That a creature standing in chains while men debate its fate might have had something to say, even if only in breath, in eyes, in stillness. And outside, the wind stirs. It runs its fingers through the bare trees. It lifts leaves in slow spirals. It presses against the glass with a sound almost like breath, almost like hooves in straw, almost like a sigh that had waited too long to be heard. No one else notices. But for that girl, for that moment, the past leans in not with facts or figures, but with the question that history too often forgets to ask. Not what was done, not who did it, but what was felt by the one who could not speak. What did the pig say? Nothing. Everything. And maybe that silence still speaks, if someone is finally quiet enough to listen. A ghost snort on windy nights. It begins as nothing, just a breeze. The kind that slips through the slats of old barns and weaves itself through the rafters like forgotten prayers. It stirs straw, tickles shutters, rustles the brittle skins of onions hanging to dry. But then there's a pause, a breath in the wind that doesn't belong, a sound too round to be wood, too wet to be leaves, too close to memory to be dismissed. A snort, faint, thick, the sort of noise that comes from deep in a chest, from behind jowls and beneath bristles. And though no one says it aloud, everyone hears it. The farmer at the edge of the field looks up from mending his tools. The child gathering eggs stops, hand frozen inside the coop. A dog growls once, then goes quiet. Just for a moment, the world leans in not to listen, but to brace, as if something older than the barn itself has turned to look. They pretend it's nothing. They always do. Someone coughs, someone swears, someone calls it a trick of wind and weather. But beneath the explanations, behind the rational shrugs, sits a different kind of recognition. Not fear, not superstition. Something quieter, something shaped like guilt. Because they remember, not clearly, not like history written on parchment or carved in stone, but in the way silence holds weight, in the way that laughter turns stiff when it stretches too far, in the way that every fence post seems a little too straight, a little too permanent, as if it was built not just to contain, but to forget. They remember the snort that came before the rope. The sound of a creature who didn't understand the charges, but understood the eyes, the judgment, the distance between innocence and safety. And now, on nights when the wind presses close and the sky refuses to clear, that snort returns not from lungs, but from the air itself, not from an animal, but from an absence. A reminder that justice once wore a robe and pointed at a pig. That silence has teeth. That memory, real memory, the kind with mud on its boots and straw in its cuffs, doesn't need names to haunt. So the villagers don't speak of it. Not exactly. But they close their barn doors a little tighter. They feed the pigs a little more gently. And when a child asks what that sound was, they say, "Nothing, just wind," even as they listen for it again. Because maybe, just maybe, it is the wind. Or maybe it's you, still waiting to be heard. The pig who was more human than the trial that killed him. In the quiet that followed your final breath, there was no audience left. The children had been ushered away. The priest was already rolling up his scroll. The magistrate yawned. A rooster crowed not out of time, just indifferently. You dangled not as a symbol, not as a warning, not as anything grand, just forgotten. In that moment, the last shred of ritual fell away, and what remained was something far more uncomfortable, the memory of a creature who had trusted right up until the end. Because you had. You'd followed the rope, the man, the crowd, not with defiance, not with understanding, but with a strange and awful willingness. Not because you knew what justice was, but because, in some quiet corner of your being, you believed in fairness. Or rather, you believed that those around you might know it and would choose it. That someone, the priest with his soft voice, the girl with the red scarf, even the boy who once fed you peas might say, "No, not this one." That belief, that capacity to hope without logic or reward, was your most human act, and they never saw it. They saw a pig, a beast, a trial, a mistake to bury under ceremony, but not the silence you adopted to avoid being misunderstood, not the way you recognized certain footsteps, not the way you flinched when you saw a hand, not because it was a threat, but because once a hand had fed you. Humans spend their lives trying to be known. You lived simply trying to be spared. And yet, in that difference, you reflected everything they refused to acknowledge. Fear without words, trust without reason, pain without the benefit of language. You mirrored back their cruelty, not in protest, but in submission, the most devastating kind of reflection. And so, your death was not theatrical. It wasn't even tragic. It was routine, official, recorded in a ledger and left behind. But still, you linger, not as spirit, not as myth, but as a quiet question in the back of the mind, a wrinkle in the history book, a line too absurd to forget, a reminder that the most damning trials are the ones in which no one listens, and the most human soul in the room may be the one on 4 legs. And now, as the wind shifts again and the barn settles into stillness, someone, perhaps a child, perhaps a butcher, will wonder, if only for a moment, what did it think? Not what you did, not what you meant, but who you were. And that question, small as it is, will be the only justice you ever receive.